They called it your patriotic duty. They said it would help your country win the war. They said it was safe. What they didn't say was that you'd never really get your money back. The war bond wasn't just a financial instrument. It was one of the most brilliant psychological tricks in history, a way to turn citizens into lenders, loyalty into liquidity, and patriotism into profit, just not yours. If you love the real stories behind money and power, hit like and subscribe before we go on. Now, let's dive in. This is the story of how governments learned to sell war as an investment and how ordinary people, trying to do the right thing, bankrolled the first global financial scam. The year was 1914. Europe was exploding, and the governments leading it into chaos were about to discover something terrifying. They were broke. Modern war was expensive in a way no one had imagined. The First World War wasn't knights on horseback. It was steel, fuel, munitions, and logistics. The industrialization of death. Every bullet had a price tag. Every tank a mortgage. Britain, France, and Germany all realized their gold reserves were draining faster than the blood on the front lines. So they turned to something new. Not soldiers, not colonies, citizens. Until then, bonds were tools of bankers and aristocrats. But when war costs exploded, politicians faced a choice: raise taxes and face revolt, or make people want to give them money. The solution was genius and sinister. They would turn debt into patriotism. In Britain, the Treasury launched war loans. Posters flooded the streets. Women in mourning black, soldiers staring from the page, "If you cannot fight," to finance. In Germany, they were called Kriegsanleihen. Citizens lined up outside banks, believing they were investing in victory itself. And in America, which entered the war in 1917, the campaign became a spectacle. The government didn't just sell bonds, it sold emotion. Buy Liberty Bonds, barked the posters, Uncle Sam pointing his finger. Movie stars, athletes, and preachers all became salesmen for the Treasury. The message was clear. If you loved your country, you'd lend it your savings. The truth was more complicated. These Liberty Bonds were, in essence, IOUs, promises to repay citizens with interest after the war. But the fine print hid the catch. They'd be repaid in dollars, not in purchasing power. And when the war ended, inflation roared. Between 1917 and 1920, U.S. prices nearly doubled. A $100 bond, redeemed at full value, could only buy half as much as before. The patriotic investor got their money back, but their wealth was gone. The same story unfolded across Europe. In Britain, the 1917 war loan paid 5% interest, decent on paper. But by the early 1920s, inflation had eaten nearly 60% of its real value. In Germany, it was worse. Hyperinflation wiped those savings out entirely. The proud patriotic lenders of 1916 became beggars by 1923. They weren't victims of military defeat, they were victims of arithmetic. War bonds weren't designed to enrich the public. They were designed to keep the machine running. And these bond drives weren't just financial lifelines, they were propaganda campaigns. They blurred the line between morality and money so effectively that to question the investment was to question your loyalty. Posters didn't talk about interest rates, they talked about heroes. Buying a bond wasn't a transaction, it was an act of faith. And faith is the most profitable currency a government can issue. That's what made it a scam, not the numbers, but the narrative. The public thought they were investing in the nation. But the nation was investing in them, in their obedience and their willingness to fund something they didn't understand. Britain alone issued over £6 billion in war bonds. In the US, Liberty Bonds raised more than $20 billion, roughly half the cost of America's entire war. But honor doesn't pay interest. And when peace came, the silence was deafening. Governments found themselves buried under mountains of IOUs they could never realistically repay. But default wasn't an option. You couldn't admit to your citizens that their patriotic investment had been a bad deal, so they changed the definition of payment. In Britain, the government converted its short-term war loans into long-term securities, the famous consols. Bonds that would, in theory, pay interest forever, but never actually mature. An elegant way of turning temporary patriotism into permanent debt. Families, veterans, and pensioners kept receiving small coupons for decades. unaware their original investment had already evaporated in real terms. It took Britain nearly 100 years to retire that debt. The last WWI bonds were paid off in 2015, almost a century after the guns went silent. In America, the same story took a quieter form. Liberty Bonds were absorbed into the machinery of the Treasury, laying the foundation for what we now call the U.S. national debt. What began as an emergency wartime measure became the operating model of government finance. The war ended, but the debt never did. The world had discovered a new kind of power, not the power to destroy, but the power to borrow forever. Once you could sell war as an investment, you could sell anything, and the modern citizen didn't just fight for their country, they financed it, willingly. By the time the Second World War began, governments didn't even need new rhetoric. The bond drives returned with Hollywood polish. Movie stars sold bonds from the screen. Walt Disney drew cartoons about patriotic savings. Even Bugs Bunny told Americans to buy bonds. Citizens once again lined up to buy victory, and once again, the returns melted away in post-war inflation. But no one cared, because the habit had become instinct. Borrowing wasn't shameful anymore. It was patriotic. Governments had cracked the code. The safest creditor in history isn't a bank. It's the citizen who believes he's part of the mission. After 1945, the old empires were broken, but one new empire had risen, built not on conquest, but on credit, the United States. The dollar replaced gold as the world's anchor, and the U.S. Treasury market, born from those old Liberty Bonds, became the global safe haven. And every time a government faces crisis, the pattern repeats. During the Cold War, buy savings bonds, support the troops. After 9/11, buy treasuries, defend freedom. During the pandemic, stimulus now. Debt later. Different wars, same mechanism. It begins with emotion, security, fear, pride, and ends with numbers on a spreadsheet. Governments learned that as long as people believed, the numbers didn't matter. You could promise returns you'd never deliver and inflate away the losses, all without losing legitimacy. Modern bonds go by new names: green bonds, recovery bonds, treasuries, sovereign debt, but the logic hasn't changed. Every crisis is financed the same way. Governments borrow in your name, with your money, and sell it back to you as moral duty. Instead of posters with soldiers, you get economists on TV telling you it's for stability. The war never really ends, it just changes shape. A war on poverty, on terror, on climate, on recession. But the emotional bait stays the same. You're not just a citizen. You're collateral. The deeper truth is this: it was never about financing war. It was about financing trust. Before 1914, people trusted gold and hard assets. After 1918, they trusted the state. When fear spikes, governments don't ask you to save yourself. They ask you to save them. And you do. Because you've been taught that your safety and the system's survival are the same thing. From the trenches of 1917 to the spreadsheets of 2025, the pattern holds. If people believe, the money is infinite. The posters said, if you can't fight, finance. A century later, it's no longer a slogan, it's a system. The world still runs on war bonds. We just stopped calling them that. Thank you for watching, all the way to the end. If this gave you a new perspective on how money and power really work, hit like and subscribe, because history always has the answers. You just have to know where to look.